thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's so lovely to see quite a few familiar faces amongst the audience. It always makes me feel a bit better that people have returned to hear me speak again. So tonight I'm talking about the winter sky, and I'm sure that many of us have got stories which we can share about heading out at night in the winter. It gets dark pretty early, so we've all had a moment when we're outside looking up, gazing at the sky and thinking about some of the contents of it, and maybe some of the stories that people in the past have had about the patterns that are made in the sky by the stars and the planets and the moon and the sun. And I'm going to talk about some of those stories and then link some of them back into some of these wonderful ancient sites that we have here in Cornwall. So I don't normally put a lot of text on my slides, so this is just a slide just to explain what we have at the moment as recognised patterns in the sky of stars. We have 88 properly designated constellations, as they're known. These constellations have a wonderful history of how they've become the recognised constellations. These constellations mostly come from ancient Greece, so 48 of these came from an ancient Greek astronomer called Ptolemy, and then more were added later on as we go through history, including some constellations which have become defunct now. So the various, during the Georgian period, certain shapes in the sky were made out to be a lot of scientific instruments, because science became suddenly very significant in the age of wonder and the age of reason. But some of those are now disappeared. These 88 constellations have been recognised by Western communities and by Arabic communities for a long time. They differ completely, perhaps, to what you would consider to be constellations in the Chinese community. They have their own sets of constellations, as did the Aboriginals and the Native Americans, and they would have different stories about what was going on in the sky. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can see in the winter sky. So if we were going to look north, if we were heading outside just after our tea and it's just got dark, and we look north, we have a set of stars which rotate around a fixed point. And this set of stars is rotating around a fixed point with a star called Polaris at the middle. Now, some of these are very recognisable, and I will talk a little bit about these as we get going.
Sorry, Carolyn. The light is really
the light's in our eyes.
Okay, let's thank you. Is that better?
I think it was better with it off. I don't know if
Yeah,
everyone
because
agrees.
Well, shall we?
Yeah, turn it on. Yeah.
Turn it on. Okay. There we go. Is that better, everyone?
Sorry, we can see you.
We can chop that from the video. And I'll suddenly go dark. Which is probably preferable anyway. So we have constellations, these recognisable constellations, and most people, when they start looking into the skies, there's a few star patterns which are incredibly familiar to them. And one of them is the W, which forms Cassiopeia in the northern sky, and the other one isn't a constellation, but it's part of a constellation, and it's a pan bucket, which is part of Ursa Major, which people sometimes know it as the Plough, but it's got various other names as well. But these constellations, as I say, rotate round a fixed point in the sky. That fixed point, which we think is fixed, is in fact not entirely fixed over the course of history. And if we rewind the clock, this is 4,000 years ago, we actually have a slight shift in what is rotating around that central point. You can still see Cassiopeia off here to one side, and the Plough is still there, but it's slightly more central towards that fixed middle point. Polaris, which is part of Ursa Major, has moved off the central point off to one side. Now, this is all due to something called precession, and our Earth is actually on a bit of a spinning top, and it's a 26,000 year cycle. And what we point to at the North and the South Celestial Pole changes over 26,000 years. It's not massively visible to us, so we wouldn't notice it over our lifetime, but between us and what was there in prehistory has changed its position slightly. But those star patterns are the same. So you still get the same patterns of stars in the sky and the same gatherings of where the stars are. So we are looking up at the same patterns that people did in prehistory. I wanted to start with a Greek story, and this is probably quite a familiar story to people. And if we are thinking about coming to the end of the autumn sky and moving into winter, this is where this story almost reaches its conclusion. So why is this story familiar to people? Well, it's because it's being put into films that we might have seen during childhood, and certainly films that have been re-released, and that's The Clash of the Titans. And we have a hero who is Perseus, and he is there to save the poor Andromeda. He gets hold of Pegasus and he fights Medusa, chopping off Medusa's head, and he goes along and then he fights Cetus, and he releases Andromeda from the Titan and saves her. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because this story has a group of these constellations all quite close together, which are dimming in the winter, at the start of the winter. They're actually setting constellations and disappearing. But as part of this group is a constellation which is part of this story, and that is Cassiopeia, this W. Now, Cassiopeia was the mother of Andromeda, and Cassiopeia, as the mother of Andromeda, claimed Andromeda was the most beautiful woman ever to have been born. And this angered the Greek gods. And the Greek gods were the ones to set the story of Perseus and Andromeda forward. And as it came to its conclusion, they cast Cassiopeia into the sky, chained. And she was positioned in the sky so she would permanently rotate upside down in chains around the central point of the northern sky. So that's a very Greek story about what is happening in that northern sky during the winter months. And so whenever you see Cassiopeia now, that W in the night sky, you can think of her as this amazing queen, because she was a queen. She was an African queen who gave birth to Andromeda, but she has been cast up there by these Greek gods to spend eternity in the sky. The other constellation in that northern sky, which I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about, is Ursa Major. Now, Ursa Major is the constellation which includes the bucket handle and the pan, which is known as the plough. So the plough is incredibly familiar, and it's probably one of the ones which, when we go outside, we can always see the plough. So those northern stars you can always see. They're not just winter stars. But in the winter, it's riding quite high in the sky, and it's used probably during prehistory as some form of clock. So you can tell if you go out in the evening what time of night it is due to the position in the sky, depending on the season. Now, Ursa Major has a huge history of stories telling about what it was. And most of these stories relate it back to being a bear. Now, this is quite an unusual bear, because bears don't usually have tails, but this depiction gives the bear a tail. But many cultures around the world think that these stars, this pattern in the sky, is a bear. And in Siberia, so we're rewinding the clock quite a way, a couple of thousand years. In Siberia, it's actually a bear followed by 3 hunters. And this is known as a tale called the Cosmic Hunt. And the Cosmic Hunt is thought to be over 15,000 years old as a tail, as the reason why they think it's so old as a tail is because the North American, Native American communities also think that these collection of stars are a bear or an animal being hunted by people. And the second person, if you look, the first person is carrying a bow and arrow, but the second person is actually carrying a cooking pot. And this tail actually extends from Russia, Siberia, all the way into North America, when there would have been access through the Bering Straits before the last ice age. So that's why they think it's 15,000 years old, this story, to have been communicated by people for a very, very long time. The cooking pot is actually a second star. So in the three people there, which make the panhandle of the plough, the second star in is actually a double star. And if you look very closely, if you are going to go outside and have a look at these star patterns, you can actually, if you've got really good eyesight, you can actually tell there's two stars. Now, I did hear the story that the Italian driving test used to check your eyesight off the ability to see these two stars. Now, I don't know whether that was true or not, but I was told that story once. But I don't know why you'd be out doing your Italian driving test anyway, so I'll take that one with a pinch of salt. But this idea of it being a man as one of the stars and the cooking pot being the other, as I said, has transgressed just out of Europe and out of Africa and over into North America. So it's a really old story. There are slight variations of this. So this one is another idea of the cosmic hunt. Instead of it being a bear, it uses a reindeer. So, as I said, there's slight, as stories get told, they often vary. And if we think of being children and we're told a word and then we whisper it onto the next child and it goes round and round the group, it usually transcends into something completely randomly different from where it started. But yeah, the ideas are the same. It's a hunt across the sky, across the northern sky. It's people hunting an animal, a significant animal within that community, whether it be a bear or a reindeer. So, as I said, this idea also has been sometimes thought not to be hunters following the bear, but baby bears itself following a mother bear. So that's another variation of the story. And this is how we recognise the constellation now. We've made this wider constellation of Ursa Major, so it's still a bear as we understand it. Within prehistory, we have various sites. One site that was written about by Paul Bonington is King Arthur's Hall, in relation to the idea that the plough or the cosmic hunt might have been important. And this is King Arthur's Hall on Bodmin Moor. It sits, when you approach from the south, on quite a high northern ridge, so you approach from the south, you're going to travel upwards and it frames the northern sky. And this is quite typical of quite a few sites across Cornwall, and he made the suggestion that the idea was to frame that cosmic hunt in the sky above the site itself. It's just one of the sites that may have had an attachment to a story like this, although those ideas are very difficult to prove because we don't know why people were building sites like this, but it's a nice idea that they might have been thinking about that northern sky, and if so, they may have considered this cosmic hunt as being relevant to them. Also in the winter, quite close to Ursa Major and Cassiopeia, we have another constellation called Boots. Now, Boots, at the bottom of Boots, there is a very bright red star called Arcturus. Arcturus shines very brightly in the winter nights, and once again, it's quite visible for many months of the year, but particularly in the winter it seems to come into its own. Now, we had an astronomer called Norman Lockyer who did a lot of work at ancient sites in Devon and Cornwall, and he was very interested in Arcturus, particularly in regard to sites on Dartmoor and at the Hurler Stone Circles on Bodmin Moor. He made links to the northern sky and the orientation of these sites being slightly off north, so he was talking about 12 to 15 degrees off north, and that Arcturus would rise perhaps before sunset, and then as the sun set you would see it riding high in the sky, and that would happen in the late winter months. But in the early winter months, what you would get is if you were out just pre-dawn, you would see Arcturus rise, and then the sun would rise, and you would get dawn again. So he considered Arcturus to be a clock star. He had a second clock star, which was another star called Capella. But Arcturus, he felt, was really significant for working out timings over the winter months. Now, one of the sites which he attached to it was Stormore on Dartmoor. Now, this is a row of large stones leading across the moor, and he felt that Arcturus would rise at the end of that stone row. And many of the stone rows on Dartmoor have this almost northern orientation, so slightly off north, so they could have been considered to be linked to Arcturus. A second one is Downtor, which is, or Hingston Hill, which is also on Dartmoor, this lovely long saddleback of a stone row leading off to a hill. And it would be interesting to think that if you were at this end where I've taken the photograph, you're actually stood in a circle, and then you could process along that road to a rising Arcturus in the distance. Would have been probably quite a fantastical moment during your ritual year. So as I said, the hurlers were similar. So the hurlers are a triple stone circle, have a similar orientation. The axis of which the three circles are aligned in a row have a similar orientation, and they could have been linked to Arcturus. Now, Norman Lockyer, in his investigations, he started to be very accurate over the timings that Arcturus would rise, and from that he started to give dates to sites like this. Rather than using the archaeological evidence to lead him, he was actually dating from objects in the sky, and he was able to do that because of that procession of where things have moved. And that's why a lot of his work got discredited by the archaeological community. But there is some aspects of it which seem really interesting. As I said, the position of this bright red star, which is quite unusual in the winter months at the end of a row like that, may have been of interest and may have been tied into the belief systems of the people who were building sites like this. If we're going to start looking to the southern skies, the constellations change throughout the year. So we have seasonal constellations, and the winter skies, when we start looking south, have some really fantastic, recognisable constellations again. So perhaps one of the first constellations that most people learn is Orion, and it's quite a recognisable constellation because of those three stars which make up the belt of Orion in the middle there. But there's also some of the zodiac constellations coming through. So we have Cancer, the two stars there, Castor and Pollux on Gemini, and then Taurus the Bull up the top there, which has, once again, a really bright red star called Aldebaran. And going above Taurus the Bull, there's a fuzzy patch, which is just off this picture, which includes the Pleiades, or the Seven Sisters. So these are all objects that people get quite familiar with over the winter months. Coming off the bottom of Orion there, you have Sirius, which is the brightest star in the northern hemisphere sky. So there's lots of stories about these groups of stars. This is Orion. So this is Orion as it would appear if you were to look directly south and see Orion during the winter months. he rises up to stand up, and Orion is once again one of these Greek constellations with a lot of Greek mythology about who he is. It's an interesting constellation because you have this bright red star at the top left, which is his shoulder, Betelgeuse or Betelgeuse. Then you have a really bright white star on the bottom right, which is on his knee or his foot, and that's Rigel. And then these belt stars. But then you also have these fuzzy patches hanging off his belt stars, which are, we now know them to be nebula or star birth regions. But those are visible in the sky. You can see the nebulosity of them. It's kind of a grey, fuzzy patch. And they were considered to be his sword in its sheath during Greek mythology. But there is a variant of Orion. It wouldn't be called Orion, but in Central Asia, he's seen to be the cosmic hunt, which is interesting. So not Ursa Major and those bears and things, but instead it's three antelopes, which are the three stars which have made up Orion's belt. So there's different stories, as I say, about what these things are. Same star patterns, but different stories. So Orion, he was one of these heroes of Greek mythology. He was fathered by three men. Take that as you will. There was no female involved in this one. And he became this epitome of a man. He was full of testosterone. He went out there, he did his fighting, his pillaging, everything else which went round with being a full, free-fathered male. He came a cropper in the end, actually because he had treated women very badly. So he was actually befell from his treatment of women. He was seen as someone as bad, so he was killed and he was placed in the sky. So there we have Diana over Orion, about to place him in his heavens. So he was going to be there for eternity, even though he hadn't been the nicest of heroes. He appears quite regularly with his hunting dog. So here he is on a vase at the left-hand side with his hunting dog. And in the sky we have Orion there, Sirius with Canis Major, which is his hunting dog at his feet. So Canis Major is always very low in the sky, but you can always tell it from the really bright Sirius once you come off those belt stars. These groups of stars, other than that one of the idea of it being three antelopes across his belt, have quite often been interpreted as a human or a man figure. And this piece of bone, which was found in France, which has been dated to 32,000 years ago, has been interpreted as etchings of those stars which make up Orion, because it's got the three belt stars and it's got a human with his hands held aloft and his knee bent, and they think that's probably a very, very early interpretation of those groupings of stars and tied. It wouldn't have been called Orion at that point, but it's a man in the sky or a human in the sky. Now, the belt stars themselves, they have lots of ideas of how they could relate into different stories. So we call them by their Arabic names. So many stars in the sky have been given Arabic names by astronomers in Babylonia and the Arabic community in the 11th and 12th centuries. So Almatak, Alman and Mintaka. They are quite bright stars in themselves, and they are instantly recognisable. If you see three stars in the sky which are quite bright, you kind of know you're onto Orion already, never mind looking around for the other ones around it. Now, there has been links made to these three bright stars with sites in Cornwall. One of them is the Hurlers, again this triple stone circle, and this was an experiment done with torches, and you can see the three lights just beyond minions there, which is the village, and the street lights have all been lit up within the circles themselves, and a photograph taken from a nearby hill called Carolyn Hill. And it was just to see if there was a representation of Orion's belt on the ground. And it's not the only prehistoric site which has been linked to Orion's belt. I should say here that that's how Orion would have looked at the time, rising over Carolyn Hill in relationship to those circles on the ground below. But we have Thornbury Cursus, which is this triple circle site up in Yorkshire, which has real links to Orion. The Cursus actually have entrances and exits in and out of them, and not only is there this spatial relationship with Orion on the ground of the three kind of circles representing these three stars on his belt, but Orion actually rises directly through those entranceways at certain significant dates of the year, and that was looked at by a lady called Jan Harding, who made these links. And those types of links could perhaps extend to the hurlers themselves. The other ones are the Priddy Barrows in Somerset, which are three circular barrows with additional stones on the outside, which may have been laid out to look like Orion's belt. The Chinese had their own interpretation of Orion, and Orion, they didn't call it Orion, they had their own stories. This collection of stars, you can see the belt there on the right-hand side to the middle. Once again, it talked about a person, though, but it was in one of their mansion. I think it's the 12th mansion. They divided the year into 28 and then divided the sky up into these sections, almost quite similar to what we have with the zodiac sections, the 12 stars coming around the zodiac band of the sky. But they had their own ideas of what these things represented. But this map was drawn in 700 AD and is one of the oldest star maps in the whole world. So it's an incredibly old representation. Sorry, it's 700 BC, not AD. So it's an incredibly old representation. It was found in caves in China. They opened up these caves and found all these scrolls, including these incredible star maps. Containing these ideas of what they thought about the stars many years ago. Now, I mentioned the Pleiades. So the Pleiades are this open star cluster, which is part of Taurus, the constellation of Taurus, and just north of Orion. It's once again one of these fuzzy patches in the sky, sometimes known as the Seven Sisters, which is unusual because most people, and even in history, could only see 6 stars. So there has been the question, what is that seventh star that was visible, whether it was a supernova or something else, something more transient, that was in that object for a while that has since disappeared. Now, they appear on ancient artifacts, often depicted as a little ring of stars with a star in the middle, and this is the Nebra sky disk, and it's an incredible object which was found in Germany, but it has a real link to Cornwall. And the Cornish link is that the bronze dish there, which is made of tin and copper, the tin came from Cornwall, as did all the gold, which went into the golden embellishments on the face of it. Now, this shows a moment in time. It's been interpreted as the waxing crescent moon and the sun with the Pleiades in between, and this shows the end of winter and the onset of spring, people think. So they think it's actually showing a proper a marking of time. So even though it doesn't act as a calendar in which we understand it as a calendar, it acts as a representation of the importance of leaving winter behind. And that's one interpretation. I know there are many interpretations of what the Nebra sky disk represents, but it's quite a nice interpretation. The only thing I will say about that interpretation is if you look where the sun is and the crescent moon, you would never get a sun and a crescent moon like that in the sky, and that's because the sun would illuminate this side of the moon and not the far side. So whether it's actually a full moon and a crescent moon, I don't know. and showing some sort of depictuation of the lunar cycle. But I do quite like the idea that it's the sun and a waxing crescent moon and the Pleiades at that moment of coming in between them, which shows you the onset of spring and leaving winter. Now, the Pleiades was linked by Norman Lockyer, our familiar Archeaoastronomer, down at the Hurlers, and he saw that the Pleiades was rising above the Merry Maidens when you actually, thank you Cheryl for this picture, stood down at Goom Riff. And if you were stood at Goom Riff with your back to Goom Riff, looking up to the Merry Maidens, you would see the Pleiades rise on the May morning before the sun rose. So it's this moment where you have a first moment where you would see the Pleiades, and it would mean that winter has well and truly been left behind now, and we're heading into summer. But the Pleiades is one of these objects which is readily available to observe high in the sky in the winter months. Here am I down at Boscanoon with Orion above, and it's another site which perhaps has a link to the Pleiades, and that's more to do with the setting point, the last point of the year when the Pleiades sets, and that you can see it. And it would set over Chapel Cambrai during the late summer months. So you're going to see it setting there, and then it's going to start rising earlier and earlier and earlier and become more and more visible. So maybe it was acting as a clock, once again, much as Arcturus could have acted as a clock. And as an object, many of these objects can act as clocks for certain times of year, but the Pleiades is framing those winter months from late summer all the way through to the last time it's visible in May. Now, I wanted to talk about the Milky Way because the Milky Way is quite high in the sky in the winter months. We've lost our ability to connect perhaps to this feature. It's one of the biggest features in the night sky, if not the biggest feature. And the reason why we've lost our connection to it is due to light pollution. And light pollution has just completely dimmed the Milky Way out for most people. I think something like 80% of people in the world now do not see the Milky Way. We can still see the Milky Way in Cornwall. We have fantastic dark skies and compared to most people. And particularly if you get away from some of the towns and out into the countryside, it is incredibly visible. Just let your eyes settle for 5 minutes and it's there. And in the winter months it rides high overhead, arching high in the sky with some of these kind of real dark lanes and features coming very visible. And the Milky Way had a huge amount of stories related to it. Once again, we have a Greek story, so this time we have Hera, the goddess Hera here, and she's been asked to suckle Hercules, who's one of Zeus's half-children, with a human woman and half god. So she doesn't want to do this, and Hercules latches onto her breast very tightly, and so he's either ripped off or she rips him off, and at that moment the milk from her breast spills across the sky, making the Milky Way. And that's one of the reasons it has its name Milky Way. It's the breast milk of Hera. But the Chinese, once again, they have their own stories. And the Milky Way in the sky has two stars. It has a leader star called Vega, and it has a following star called Altar. And their story is about the two stars. So Vega is seen as a weaver girl and Altar as a shepherd boy. And the weaver girl's father doesn't want her, Vega, seeing Altar, the shepherd boy. So he puts a river between the two of them, and so they can never meet. And there is only one day a year where everything darkens in the Milky Way, and those two stars come together to meet, to confess their dying love to each other before they are separated once again. And it's very typical of stories of the Milky Way to be seen as a river or a pathway or a place for someone to make a journey along through the sky. And that's goes into the Native American communities, who quite often see this as a pathway for the souls of their dead, or the stars are representative of their ancestors in the sky, or it's a place where people walk along after they've just died to reach the afterlife. So there are various variations of this, but it's a pathway for the dead, or a place where they reside. In the Mayan community, they have a huge amount of interesting stories about the Milky Way. The Milky Way here is represented here by these dots on the left-hand side. This shaman here on the left, underneath the dots, he's on the terrestrial, so he's inside, he's one of us, he's on the land. Those other three shamans off to the right, they are the gods in the sky, so they are beyond the Milky Way. That's where you go to once you leave the earth and transcend into the sky. But they have lots of symbolism within these kind of drawings about what is going on, and different gods and goddesses that appear at different times of year. The feathers are quite representative of this, and then they've got the serpent god there hanging over the sky before the Milky Way. So absolutely fascinating stories about the Milky Way in the sky. And then if we get down into Australia, there are many stories about the Milky Way, and as I say, it's such a fascinating object, even in their winter skies. Because we're on a flat plane, the Milky Way is we're either looking into the centre of the Milky Way, or we're looking across the arms of our galaxy, the spiral arms of our galaxy. And here in the summer, we're looking into the centre. They're looking into the centre of the Milky Way in their winter. It's an incredibly bright and luminous space in the sky. And there is a dark bit though, which is a dust flake, and they think that's an emu. And the emu actually rises up during the winter months, and then it gradually dips down and disappears. And they have this emu rising up and dipping down. At one moment, he actually lays eggs and sits on a nest. So there's this whole tale of what's going on with this emu, and it's one of their gods in the sky. But the Milky Way is a fascinating object, and one of my favourite ones to talk about when we start talking about stories in the sky. And it's one of the objects in the cosmos which is so visible during the winter if you've got dark skies. Now, it's not the most wonderful picture, but this is Boscanoon. I did want to talk a little bit about the moon in the winter. So when we think about the moon, you're really thinking about it being a reflection of the sun's light. So if we're starting to think about the sun and where the sun is during the course of the year, in the winter we get very little sun, and it rises and sets quite low on the horizon. The full moon is actually doing it in opposite. And it actually is incredibly large and bright full moon during the winter months. The biggest and brightest full moons are around the winter solstice. And people in prehistory were very interested in these full moons. They were interested in the full moons around the winter solstice as well as around the summer solstice. But I think the one around the winter solstice, which brought additional light to them during the winter months, would have been really important, not just for ritual ideas, but also for practical reasons, to extend their day longer than just the sort of 4:30 p.m. when it gets dark. And once you've got that full moon up there, if you let your eyes adapt, you can still move about. So Boscanoon here, this is aligned to the full moon, and here's the winter months, but only every about 19 years, the full moon actually moves gradually in the winter months towards setting over Carngalva, which is there. Now it's quite exciting, it's called a standstill, a major lunar standstill, and we're about to head into major lunar standstill. It only comes around every 18.6 years or 19 years. And the full moon this winter and the full moon the next winter will be the standstill years, and we should be getting very close to it setting over Carngalva. Now, because of the tilt of the Earth and that movement, we're never going to see what people in prehistory saw. But I photographed this one 2 years ago. I unfortunately didn't get this year's because it would have been slightly closer, but it was so cloudy that I wasn't able to photograph that.
Sorry, did you say that's the Boscawen stone site?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
Boscawen, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
Boscawen.
Oh, sorry, Boscawen. Sorry if
Okay.
I said the wrong one there.
Thanks, sorry.
Yes, Boscawen, 9 maidens. Now, it does also happen at the Stripple Stones over on Bodmin Moor, and the moon will set over Hawkstor there. If you're thinking of going to Callanish, which is kind of one of the ones with a lot of fanfare around the standstill, you need to be there for the summer solstice. So you can still do these ones down here. You can come and do these ones at the winter solstice, but you need to go up to Callanish for the summer solstice because you're going to be looking at the southern sky and the moon going across the outline of the hills, which looks like a reclining lady. But so you can actually do both. You can go up to Scotland, see that one, and come to these ones as well. Now, the winter sun is also really significant, and it's not to be forgotten about, even though I said it's very low in the sky. And here I am at Tregasil, where the winter solstice sunset is about to go into the Sea Gap and set over the Isles of Scilly, which are framed on the Sea Gap. There are many sites aligned to winter solstice, and it is an incredibly important alignment, and probably the most sites in the country are aligned winter solstice way rather than summer solstice way. It was a time of renewal for people, a time for moving away from those darkest days back into the days of light. And Tregasil is just one site, but there are many, many more sites, and I could have probably done a whole talk on winter solstice sun-aligned sites, but I just wanted to leave this one here because it is an incredible thing to go and see that. There wouldn't have been the hedgerow there would have been a second circle just slightly east of that one, but they definitely deliberately chose this site to limit the amount of sea and to frame the Isles of Scilly on that sea in the distance with that winter solstice sun dropping over them. So I want to finish there. I want to say, as I said, there are lots of star stories about the winter, and I'm sure we've all got our own. And just because we've listened to some of the more written about ones and the ones which are attached to the constellations, it doesn't mean that they're the only ones that we can think about. I always think it's nice to go out, and it's something that I do when I'm teaching at the school, is I get the children to make their own star stories up and their own groupings of stars, of things that we see in the sky and what's meaningful to them as well. And I'm sure that's what many people did in the past as well. They had their own stories which they attached to their own belief systems and their own things that had happened to them within their own lives as well. But thank you very much for listening. I'm quite happy to take some questions.
So there was 19 stones in the ring to represent the cycle every 19 or 18 and a half years.
Yeah, so there are 19 stones at Tregasil, and there are at 9 maidens, or possibly at 9 maidens, but yes, it has been postulated that they could be a representative of those cycles. But you get to other stone circle sites further afield, and there are many different numbers of stones in those. So, yeah.
Is it also worth mentioning the metonic cycle, because this is, as I understand it, the period of time of exactly 19 years when you can see the sun and the moon in the same relationship to each other in the sky. Now, if that cycle was also known by the prehistoric people, and all the stone circles in West Penwith had 19 stones, it seems to me beyond coincidence.
Yes, exactly.
So they were aware of a lot of this stuff in the skies, and they represented it in their circles.
Yeah, so if you were to
That's just my
visit,
theory.
yeah, so if you were to
Agree.
visit Tregasil and on the winter solstice and there to be a full moon, you've got to wait 19 years to visit Tregasil on the winter solstice and to be a full moon. So it's quite an easy thing for them to have started to recognise that. But yeah, it could have been Metonic, the Metonic cycle as it's known. It's named after an ancient Greek called Meton, but it was known about and written about in the Babylonian text much before that. But yeah, it's either that or it could be the standstill, or it could be, it seems a little bit more than just chance that there are 19 stones in the last 4 remaining circles in West Cornwall.
I have a question.
Yes.
So we think that maybe some of these sites could have been used for thousands of years, possibly. I think that's a theory, isn't it?
Yeah.
Would the skies have changed quite significantly during that time?
No, not as I said. There is a slight change in position in the stars, but the actual star patterns would have been pretty much as they were then. The planetary positions change quite rapidly, but the actual position that they would travel in with the sun and the moon would be the same. And as I say, the Milky Way would have been in the same position. There would have been transient events like comets and things coming through, which may have been of interest to them. There are some supernovas which have been represented in ancient rock art around the world and things, but they are so few and far between, these representations, and they're difficult to know if those interpretations would be correct. But yeah, pretty much as that they were looking at the sky is what we get to see.
I do remember reading on the pyramids of Giza that when they were built, they were like 0.6 degrees off the North Star.
Okay, yeah.
So that was an example of what everywhere was a little bit off. But you know that because it was aligned at that time during the Egyptian pyramids, and then it's gone 0.6 in our time now.
Okay.
That's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. Thank you, Christian. Anyone else? No? Good. Well, I was going to say thank you all for coming. We have got some leaflets at the back. I've got a couple of books as well, which are for sale. So if you want one of those, I know Kelly can help with those. And but yeah, I'm here if you want to chat or ask anything at the end. But thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.